What is the exploitation of labor power? In order to answer this question, we must first investigate how purchasing a commodity allows an investor to end up with a surplus value. Investors can't simply buy a commodity, do nothing, and then proceed to sell it for more than they bought it for. While this type of charlatanism does exist, the sale of a commodity for more than its exchange value doesn't generate surplus value. If this was the case, investors would always win on their sale and lose on their purchase, creating a zero-sum gain. Investors would have to purchase a commodity for more than its exchange value to then sell it for even more in an infinite cycle. This would make capital accumulation impossible, as investors would have to spend the entirety of what they just made on their last commodity to then purchase their next one. In order for surplus value to be created, both parties involved have to end up in a more favorable position than they started. Therefore, the total amount of value in existence will have increased. To see how this is possible, where exchange value, and tangentially surplus value comes from, needs to be examined. Exchange value is obviously not a physical aspect of a commodity. No physicist has ever isolated exchange value in the fundamental elements of matter. Exchange value instead has to emerge based off some other property of the product. Contemporary capitalist economists claim that exchange value is derived from supply and demand. This is actually a misnomer. While it does affect the momentary cost of a commodity, it doesn't affect its inherent exchange value. The supply or demand of a product may cause it to rise or fall in price, but that price will always be relatively close to its exchange value. If supply and demand were the end-all be-all of exchange value, there would be instances of something such as cereal being more expensive than a house, so long as its demand is higher and its supply is lower. It might come to be more expensive than related breakfast products, but never to such an extent as to exceed significantly more expensive commodities. Rather, for exchange value to be quantified, a comparable feature of the products must first be identified. In the instances of cereal in a house, it may appear as though size is the determining factor. But this doesn't work for other comparisons. A cell phone tends to cost more than a desk, despite the desk being several times larger. It's also a common trap to assume that it's directly proportional to the product's use value. If it were, then products required for survival, such as food and water, would be the most expensive. Due to the seemingly impossible comparability between commodities, Aristotle had concluded that no two products can ever be equal. The exchange of those products, then, he conjectured, is merely the illusion of equality. Therefore, people just must simply exchange unequal commodities. When taken seriously, this interpretation leaves us with the question of how products that are materially unalike, with unique properties, can systematically be exchanged with each other in pre-established proportions. Instead, Adam Smith and David Ricardo were able to determine that the comparable feature isn't within the product itself, but rather in how it was made. Consider the hypothetical scenario where someone has the amount of wood required to manufacture either 4 chairs or 1 table. Each chair also requires 1/4 the amount of labor hours as the table. So if it takes 8 hours of carpentry to manufacture the table, then it takes 2 hours of comparable labor to manufacture a chair. If that individual put in the effort to produce a table, it would make no sense for them to then exchange that table for a single chair. A trade of 1 table for 4 chairs, however, makes perfect sense. No person loses out in the exchange, and both parties end up with a superior product to the raw wood they started with. This means that the exchange value of a commodity is predicated on the labor that produced it. The more labor hours that went into producing a commodity, the more it's worth, as this is the amount of work an individual is circumventing for themselves in the purchase of the product. However, it's also apparent that no labor is exactly alike. The amount of effort, strain, time, etc. are all important when considering how many labor hours goes into producing something. This is why, when comparing labor hours, it's important to understand that what we're actually comparing is socially abstract labor hours. This subsumes the amalgamation of all the different aspects of labor that goes into the average production of a product. Meaning, even if it takes one person 6 hours to produce a commodity, this will not necessarily reflect the exchange value of the commodity. If it takes the average laborer 2 hours to produce that same commodity, the exchange value of that commodity will instead reflect the 2 hours worth of effort. Regardless of how many labor hours it takes any given individual to produce a commodity, the exchange value will always reflect the number of socially abstract labor hours required to produce it. Socially abstract labor is responsible for not just the exchange value of all commodities, but also all alterations of that value. In the ground, iron is worthless. No one can exchange it or use it. The labor of harvesting iron from the ground gives it value. The labor of turning iron into useful tools increases that value. At each point from the iron being pulled from the ground to it being made into tools, an investor purchases the commodity, rents the labor to transform it, and then sells it for more than their initial investment. This is where surplus value comes from. A commodity's value increases in a directly proportional way to the amount of abstract labor hours required to bring it from point A to point B. Thus, as money is the super commodity, labor is the super commodity. Capitalism relies on labor power, Without it, there can be no surplus value, and without surplus value, there can be no capital. Given that surplus value is a byproduct of labor within the capitalist system, it's impossible for a laborer to ever earn the value of their labor. Say that a laborer produces a commodity. The materials required to produce this commodity cost $5. The laborer can produce 12 of this commodity during their 12-hour shift, and the commodity sells for $50 each. Over the course of their shift, the laborer will have produced $600 worth of commodities. After accounting for the $60 in materials, they've generated $540 in surplus value, making that the value of their labor. The investor, however, can't pay the laborer $540. If they did, they'd make no profit and eventually go out of business. So instead, they pay them a wage of, say, $15 an hour. From the laborer's perspective, they produced $540 worth of value in 12 hours. Therefore, the value of their labor would be $45 an hour. If they're only getting paid $15 an hour, that means that every hour $30 is being stolen from them as the investor siphons it off of what they pay them. And the investor, through no labor of their own, without contributing any value, is making $30 an hour off of someone else's work. From the investor's perspective, the laborer produces $540 worth of value in 12 hours and costs them $180 during that period of time, therefore profiting them $360. With the value of the laborer's labor being $45 an hour, and the investor paying them $180 overall, after 4 hours, the laborer has completely paid their own wages. This is known as the essential labor period. The remaining 8 hours after this, the laborer is working for free. This is known as the surplus labor period. Regardless of which point of view you ascribe to, it's clear that the laborer is being exploited by not earning the value of their labor. It would make far more sense for the laborers to work for themselves and each other. This way, they could actually earn the full value of their labor. Removing the investor from the equation allows each laborer to be paid what they generate in surplus value by simply sharing the profits. Without someone siphoning off the majority of the value they produce, each laborer would stand to gain substantially more. In this example, it's the difference between $180 and $540 a day, but in most real-life scenarios, it's actually significantly more. The corporation known as Amazon is worth $2.13 trillion, and has roughly 1.56 million employees working to produce that value. If Amazon were instead a worker-owned cooperative, rather than a traditional capitalist enterprise, each employee would be worth $1.36 million. Instead, its employees make near-poverty wages while the owner Jeff Bezos has a net worth that's measured in the hundreds of billions. As a result of his employees producing this surplus value for his company, Jeff Bezos' net worth is increasing by roughly $10 million an hour. This means that every day he could turn 240 impoverished individuals into millionaires and his net worth wouldn't decrease infinitesimally. This is also true of all the other richest people in the world such as Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg. But alternatively to spreading their fortunes around, they use it to eternally accumulate more and more capital as they drown in ever amassing unimaginable wealth. This form of organization is what prevents the vast majority of people from ever having the amount of money required to accumulate capital for themselves. It's also what makes it difficult to often have enough money to even prove the exchange value of the essential commodities they need to survive. Investors tend to pay laborers the least they can for them to meet their own sustenance. In this way, the investor stifles the laborer from becoming financially independent from them. This can be seen in the fact that in the United States, the wealthiest country on earth, the majority of people live paycheck to paycheck and are unable to afford even a $200 emergency. The money exists, but it's all being withheld from the laborers by those at the top. I hope that you enjoyed this essay on the exploitation of labor power. Please consider following for more. Thank you.